Maxwell Ashton adjusted his clip-on bow tie, studying his reflection in the mirror. The starched white shirt and black slacks felt foreign against his skin, a far cry from his usual tailored suits. He ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, marveling at how different he looked without his signature styling products. "You're sure about this, sir?" his butler, Jeffrey, asked from the doorway. Maxwell nodded, a determined glint in his eye. "Absolutely. It's time I see how the other half lives." For years, Maxwell had built his fortune in real estate development, transforming struggling neighborhoods into luxurious high-rises and exclusive shopping districts. He'd always justified it as progress, convincing himself that he was improving lives by bringing in new businesses and cleaning up rundown areas. But lately, a gnawing doubt had taken root in his mind. He'd overheard some of his staff discussing the families displaced by his latest project, and their words had struck a chord. Was he really making the world better, or just lining his own pockets at the expense of others? That's when the idea had come to him. He would go undercover as a waiter in one of the trendy restaurants he'd helped develop to see firsthand how people in the service industry lived. Maybe then he'd understand the true impact of his work. "Remember, sir," Jeffrey cautioned, "your reservation at Lumiere is for 7 p.m. That gives you 4 hours to work your shift at the Rustic Spoon." Maxwell nodded, slipping a simple watch onto his wrist instead of his usual Rolex. "I'll be there. And Jeffrey, not a word of this to anyone." The butler bowed slightly. "Of course, sir. Good luck." As Maxwell drove his nondescript sedan to the small farm-to-table restaurant he'd be working at, he felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He'd pulled some strings to arrange this trial shift without arousing suspicion, but he still worried about being recognized. The Rustic Spoon was busy when he arrived, the dinner rush in full swing. The manager, a harried-looking woman named Tessa, barely glanced at him before thrusting a notepad into his hands. "You're Maxwell, right? The new guy? Great. Sarah will show you the ropes. Try not to break anything." And just like that, he was thrown into the deep end. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Maxwell struggled to keep up with the pace, fumbling orders and bumping into other servers. His feet ached, and he was sweating through his crisp white shirt. But there was also an unexpected thrill to the work, a satisfaction in the controlled chaos of the restaurant floor. As his shift neared its end, Maxwell found himself waiting on a table in the corner. A woman sat alone, her dark curls framing a face etched with worry. She was absently stirring a cup of coffee, lost in thought. "Good evening, miss," Maxwell said, adopting the polite tone he'd been practicing all night. "Are you ready to order?" The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, I was miles away." She glanced at the menu, then back at Maxwell with a rueful smile. "To be honest, I'm not sure I should even be here. It's a bit out of my budget." Maxwell felt a pang of sympathy. He'd seen that look before, on the faces of people being priced out of their homes by his developments. "Perhaps I could recommend something," he offered gently. The woman hesitated, then nodded. "That would be nice, thank you." As Maxwell described some of the more affordable options, he found himself drawn into conversation with the woman, whose name was Elena. She was a social worker, he learned, dedicated to helping at-risk youth in the neighborhood. "It's getting harder, though," Elena confided. "With all the new development, rents are skyrocketing. Families are being pushed out, and the kids I work with are struggling to find stability." Maxwell felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew all too well which developments she was talking about. "That must be challenging," he managed to say. Elena nodded, her eyes filled with a passionate fire. "It is. But these kids, they're resilient. They just need a chance, you know? A safe place to grow and learn. That's why I'm here, actually." She gestured around the restaurant. "I'm meeting with a potential donor later. I'm hoping to convince him to fund a new community center." Maxwell's interest was piqued. "Oh? And who's the donor?" "Maxwell Ashton," Elena replied, and Maxwell nearly dropped his notepad. "He's behind a lot of the new construction around here. I'm hoping I can appeal to his sense of social responsibility. It took all of Maxwell's self-control not to reveal himself right then and there. Instead, he simply nodded and said, "Well, I hope it goes well. Your work sounds very important." As he walked away from Elena's table, Maxwell's mind was racing. He'd come here to understand the impact of his work, and now he was faced with a direct challenge to his methods. Part of him wanted to reveal his true identity, to assure Elena that he'd fund her project on the spot. But another part, a part he was only just beginning to recognize, knew that wouldn't be enough. The rest of his shift passed in a blur. As he hung up his apron and prepared to leave, Maxwell found himself lingering, watching Elena as she nursed her coffee and waited for her meeting. He was about to walk out the door when he heard a commotion. Turning, he saw Elena arguing with a man in an expensive suit. "I'm sorry, Ms. Rodriguez, but Mr. Ashton won't be able to make it tonight," the man was saying. "He's asked me to inform you that he's not interested in your proposal at this time." Maxwell felt a surge of anger, at himself, at the system he'd helped create. Without thinking, he strode over to the table. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the man in the suit. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you saying that Mr. Ashton won't even listen to this woman's proposal?" The man looked affronted. "This is a private matter, sir. Please return to your duties." But Maxwell wasn't backing down. "I may just be a waiter, but I've been serving Ms. Rodriguez all evening. I've heard about her work, about the lives she's trying to change, and you're telling me that a man as wealthy as Maxwell Ashton can't spare an hour of his time to hear her out?" Elena looked at Maxwell in surprise, a mix of gratitude and embarrassment on her face. "It's all right," she said softly. "I appreciate your concern, but—" "No, it's not all right," Maxwell insisted, surprising himself with his vehemence. "People like Mr. Ashton have a responsibility to the communities they build in. They can't just ignore the consequences of their actions." The man in the suit was turning red. "Now see here." But Maxwell was on a roll. If Mr. Ashton won't meet with Ms. Rodriguez, then maybe he's not the right person to approach. Maybe it's time to look for investors who actually care about more than just their profit margins. A hush had fallen over the restaurant. Other diners were watching the scene unfold with interest. Maxwell could see Tessa hovering nearby, likely worried about the disruption, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Elena stood up, placing a hand on Maxwell's arm. "Thank you," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You don't know how much it means to hear someone say that, but I don't want to cause any trouble. I should go." As she gathered her things, Maxwell made a split-second decision. "Wait," he said. I know someone who might be interested in your proposal, someone who's been rethinking their approach to development. Would you be willing to meet with them?" Elena looked skeptical. "I don't know." "Please," Maxwell pressed. "I promise it will be worth your time." After a moment's hesitation, Elena nodded. "All right. When and where?" Maxwell glanced at his watch. It was nearly 7 p.m. He was supposed to be at Lumiere, playing the role of the wealthy benefactor. But suddenly that charade seemed hollow and meaningless. "How about right now?" he suggested. "There's a cafe down the street. We could talk there." Elena agreed, and they left the restaurant together, ignoring the sputtering protests of the man in the suit. As they walked, Maxwell felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. In the cafe, over steaming cups of coffee, Maxwell listened as Elena passionately described her vision for the community center. She spoke of after-school programs, job training for parents, health clinics, and green spaces where children could play safely. "The thing is," Elena said, her eyes alight with enthusiasm, "these families don't want handouts. They want opportunities, a chance to build better lives for themselves and their children. This center could be the catalyst for real, positive change in the neighborhood." Maxwell nodded, absorbing every word. He'd heard pitches like this before, of course, but always from behind a desk, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power. Here, in this modest cafe, Elena's words carried a raw authenticity that touched him deeply. "It sounds wonderful," he said sincerely. "But I have to ask, why approach Maxwell Ashton? From what I've heard, he doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to community development." Elena sighed, running a hand through her curls. "Believe me, I know. But he has the resources to make this happen. And I hoped that if he could see the potential impact, he might be willing to change his approach." Maxwell felt a pang of guilt. "And if he's not, what then?" The real neighborhood, not just the sanitized version I see from my office window. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Now? It's getting late." "I know," Maxwell said, "but I want to see it through your eyes. If we're going to work together on this, I need to understand the community as it really is." After a moment's consideration, Elena agreed. They spent the next few hours walking the streets of the neighborhood, with Elena pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the people who lived and worked there. Maxwell saw boarded-up storefronts next to thriving family businesses, community gardens squeezed between aging apartment buildings, and groups of young people gathered on street corners, their laughter echoing in the night air. As they walked, Maxwell found himself seeing the neighborhood, and Elena, in a new light. He noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her work, the gentle way she greeted people they passed on the street, the fierce protectiveness she felt for this community. For her part, Elena began to see beyond the wealthy developer she'd initially perceived Maxwell to be. She saw his genuine interest in learning, his willingness to acknowledge his mistakes, and the spark of idealism that still burned beneath years of corporate success. As they stood on a crumbling basketball court, watching a group of teenagers shoot hoops under flickering streetlights, Maxwell made a quiet vow to himself. He would use his resources and influence not just to build a community center, but to revitalize this neighborhood in a way that preserved its character and supported its residents. It wouldn't be easy. He knew he'd face resistance from his board, from investors, maybe even from some members of the community who distrusted his intentions. But looking at Elena, seeing the hope and determination in her eyes, Maxwell knew he was on the right path. As the night drew to a close, they found themselves back where they'd started, outside the Rustic Spoon. The restaurant was dark now, the streets quiet except for the distant sounds of traffic and music drifting from open windows. "Thank you," Maxwell said softly, "for giving me a chance, for showing me your world." Elena smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. "Thank you for listening, for being willing to change." There was a moment of charged silence between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Maxwell felt a connection to Elena that went beyond their shared goals for the community, but he also knew that trust would take time to build and that the work ahead of them was more important than any personal feelings he might be developing. "So," he said, breaking the moment, "shall we meet tomorrow to start working on a concrete plan?" Elena nodded, her professional demeanor sliding back into place. "Yes, that would be good. But Maxwell, I hope you understand that this isn't going to be a quick fix. Real change takes time and commitment." "I know," Maxwell replied seriously, "and I'm in this for the long haul, whatever it takes." As they parted ways, Maxwell felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. He knew that the path ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. Maxwell threw himself into the community center project with an energy that surprised even himself. He attended town hall meetings, met with local leaders, and spent countless hours with Elena, poring over plans and budgets. It wasn't always easy. There were heated arguments and moments of frustration on both sides. Maxwell had to learn to listen more than he spoke, to set aside his instinct to bulldoze through obstacles with money and influence. Elena, for her part, had to learn to trust that Maxwell's intentions were genuine, to see past her initial skepticism of his motives. But slowly, surely, progress was made. The community center began to take shape, not just as a building, but as a symbol of what was possible when different worlds came together. One crisp autumn evening, about 6 months after their first meeting, Maxwell and Elena stood on the roof of the partially constructed community center, looking out over the neighborhood. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, casting a warm glow over the mix of old and new buildings. "I still can't quite believe this is happening," Elena said softly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Do you remember that first night when you were pretending to be a waiter? I was so close to giving up." Maxwell nodded, a lump forming in his throat. "I remember. You looked so defeated, but there was still this fire in your eyes. That's what caught my attention, you know. Your unwillingness to give up, even when things seemed hopeless." Elena turned to face him, a small smile playing on her lips. "And what about you, the millionaire in disguise trying to understand how the other half lives? Did you ever imagine it would lead to this?" Maxwell chuckled, shaking his head. "Not in my wildest dreams, but I'm grateful it did. Working on this project, getting to know this community. It's changed me, Elena, in ways I'm still trying to understand." There was a moment of comfortable silence between them, filled with the sounds of the city below. Children laughing, car horns honking, the distant rumble of the subway. "You know," Elena said thoughtfully, "when we first started working together, I was so focused on the project that I didn't let myself see you as a person. You were just the means to an end, the wealthy benefactor who could make this happen." Maxwell nodded, understanding. "And I probably saw you the same way at first, the passionate crusader who could help me assuage my guilty conscience." "But it's not like that anymore, is it?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Maxwell turned to face her, his heart pounding. Over the past months, he'd found himself increasingly drawn to Elena, not just to her passion for her work, but to her quick wit, her unwavering integrity, and the way her whole face lit up when she smiled. But he'd held back, unsure if she felt the same way, unwilling to jeopardize the delicate balance they'd achieved. "No," he said softly. "It's not like that at all." Elena took a step closer, her eyes searching his face. "I've been thinking a lot about that night at the restaurant, about how you stood up for me, even when you thought you were just a waiter. That wasn't about guilt or PR, that was you, the real you." Maxwell felt a surge of emotion. "Elena, I care about you, more than I ever expected to. But I don't want to complicate things or make you uncomfortable. The work we're doing here is too important." Elena reached out, taking his hand in hers. "What if it doesn't have to be one or the other? What if we can have both, the work and whatever this is between us?" Maxwell's breath caught in his throat. He looked at their intertwined hands, then back at Elena's face, seeing his own hope and uncertainty reflected in her eyes. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Very much." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the rooftop, Maxwell and Elena shared their first kiss. It was tentative at first, both of them aware of the complexities of their situation. But as the kiss deepened, they let themselves get lost in the moment, in the promise of something new and unexpected. When they finally pulled apart, Elena rested her forehead against Maxwell's, a soft laugh escaping her lips. "You know, this isn't going to be easy. There are going to be people who don't understand, who think you're taking advantage or I'm after your money." Maxwell nodded, his arms still around her waist. "I know. But we've faced bigger challenges, haven't we? We'll figure it out together." As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms with the city spread out before them, Maxwell marveled at the twists and turns that had brought him to this moment. He'd started this journey looking for understanding, for a way to ease his conscience. Instead, he'd found purpose, community, and a love he never expected. The community center would open its doors 6 months later, a testament to what could be achieved when different worlds came together with a common goal. But for Maxwell and Elena, it was more than just a building. It was the foundation of a new life, one built on mutual respect, shared values, and a deep, abiding love.